Welcome to this explainer. Look, we all know the federal marketplace is absolutely massive, but breaking in as a prime contractor, that can be incredibly daunting. Subcontracting is often viewed as this incredibly lucrative backdoor to build your empire from the inside out, provided you master the rules, of course. So let's dive right in and explore how you can survive and thrive, whether you're taking the lead or partnering up. Here is our quick roadmap for today. Number 1, prime versus subcontractor rules. 2, FAR Part 44 explained. 3, the limitations on subcontracting. 4, navigating subcontracting plans. And finally, 5, flowdowns and payment rules. Starting off with Section 1, prime versus subcontractor roles, understanding the divide. The difference here is literally night and day. A prime contractor holds the direct agreement with the federal government. They carry the heavy administrative burden, manage all the compliance, and take on full liability for the entire scope of work. Essentially, if a sub messes up, the government still holds the prime accountable. A subcontractor, on the other hand, only has an agreement with the prime. Their risk and scope are strictly limited, which offers a much lower risk entry point, though you do give up direct control with the agency. Moving right along to Section 2, FAR Part 44 explained, the rules of engagement. All right, before we really get into FAR Part 44, we've got to talk about the CPSR. That stands for the Contractor Purchasing System Review. This is the government's oversight process to evaluate how efficiently and fairly a prime manages its subcontracting. What you should really take away from this is that if a prime has an approved purchasing system, it drastically streamlines their need to get a contracting officer's consent every single time they want to bring on a new subcontractor. It's a huge time saver. So the government actually modernized FAR Part 44 recently, and honestly, it's a real game changer. It's much more accessible now. We have clearer consent rules and advanced notification thresholds. Also, contracting officers are now required to evaluate the need for a CPSR at least once every 3 years, ensuring some consistent oversight. Furthermore, they simplified the flow-down requirements for commercial subcontracts. This is a massive win for commercial small businesses because it creates clearer pathways to win work without getting buried in unnecessary government compliance. Okay, let's hit Section 3, the limitations on subcontracting, or what I like to call the math behind the work. You see, the government really hates pass-through arrangements, where a prime wins a contract and then just kicks back while a sub does all the heavy lifting. So for surface contracts, the math is straightforward. The prime contractor must self-perform a minimum of 50% of the work. That means they absolutely cannot subcontract out more than 50% of the total contract amount. And trust me, violating this can lead to severe penalties, up to and including complete contract termination. But hold on, that 50% rule, it's not a blanket rule for everything. For example, if you look at general construction contracts, the required minimum self-performance threshold drops significantly to just 15%, and special trade construction sits right at 25%. So you absolutely must know the exact threshold tied to your specific contract type. Now this is where it gets really interesting. Let me introduce you to a brilliant strategic loophole introduced by the government, the similarly situated entity. If you are a small business prime, let's say you're a service-disabled veteran-owned small business, and you subcontract to another first-tier sub with that exact same status, the work they do does not count against your strict subcontracting limit. It's amazing. This rule encourages legitimate teaming among qualified small businesses without unfairly penalizing the prime. So what happens when things get, a little complicated? Like in a mixed contract that includes both services and supplies. Well, recent FAR revisions clarified that the 50% limitation only applies to the primary portion of the contract, which is determined by the assigned NAICS code. If the code is for services, you only calculate that 50% limit against the services portion. You literally just ignore the supplies part for the math. Next up, Section 4, navigating subcontracting plans, setting goals, and tracking progress. If you're a prime and you win a contract over $750,000 or $1.5 million for construction, you must submit a subcontracting plan. This plan guarantees that small businesses actually get an equitable share of those taxpayer dollars. The prime has to set very specific percentage goals for various socioeconomic categories. We're talking women-owned, hub-zone, service-disabled veteran-owned businesses, the whole shebang. And yes, the government actively monitors these targets. And speaking of monitoring, primes are held to a very strict electronic reporting rhythm using the ESRS system. They have to submit individual subcontract reports, or ISRS, semi-annually every March 31st and September 30th. Then, an annual summary subcontract report is due by October 30th. Failing to hit these deadlines or failing to make a good faith effort to meet those socioeconomic goals, that can result in some really severe past performance penalties for the prime.
All right, let's get into the heavy stuff. Section 5, Flowdowns and Payment Rules, the legal traps and realities.
Listen closely here, because a flow-down clause can basically be a legal trapdoor. It takes the obligations the prime has to the government and just pushes them directly down onto the subcontractor. The absolute biggest trap for a subcontractor is accepting a vague, catch-all flow-down clause without ever actually reading the prime contract. If you agree to a clause that says you are bound by all applicable provisions of the prime contract, you are flying blind into potentially massive liability. Here's a super specific tactical tip that could literally save your business. The government can terminate a prime contract for convenience at any time, even if no one did anything wrong. Primes often try to flow this exact clause down to their subs so they can terminate the sub at will. As a sub, you absolutely must negotiate to ensure a termination for convenience clause only applies to you if the prime is terminated by the government first. Okay, let's talk about everyone's favorite topic, cash flow. The 1982 Federal Prompt Payment Act was actually designed to stop notoriously slow government payments. The intended flow works like a simple 1-2 step. 1. The government has 30 days to pay the prime contractor after receiving a proper invoice. 2. Once the prime receives those funds, they are legally required to pay their subcontractors within exactly 7 days. But here is the hard legal reality that shatters a very common misconception out there. What happens if the prime just doesn't pay the sub in 7 days? Well, a federal district court case plainly established that subcontractors cannot actually sue prime contractors under the Federal Prompt Payment Act. No way. Congress just did not create a private right of action for the sub. If you're an unpaid subcontractor, you can't rely on the Prompt Payment Act in court. You have to seek remedies through standard breach of contract claims under your specific subcontract agreement.
Finally, Section 6, the survival strategy, choosing your path.
At the end of the day, it all comes down to choosing the path that fits your business's current capacity and goals. Priming gives you direct agency control and much higher revenue potential, but it demands massive compliance infrastructure and full liability. Subcontracting? Well, that offers protected growth, allowing you to learn the ropes and build federal past performance while the prime shoulders the heavy administrative burden. So I leave you with this. Will you take on the full liability to control the federal contract or master the rules of subcontracting to build your empire from the inside out? Think carefully about your next strategic move. Thanks for joining me on this explainer.